When we think about the Neolithic period of Britain, what comes to mind? Stonehenge? But what if I told you there was a site in the south of England that dates to roughly 1,000 years before the construction of Stonehenge? A site of both social and ritualistic importance.
There we go. It's remarkable, isn't it? We'd half planned to just be dropped off actually physically on the site, but we've actually got to make the journey up to it, which actually I think is quite poignant, because that's what our ancestors would have had to have done as well. And I think I can see a path, and we'll follow that one. I've just seen 2 magpies, so that's a good sign, that's good luck. It's up here somewhere. When it comes to Neolithic enclosures, when it comes to even fortifications, which this isn't, this is what's called a causeway enclosure, so it's non-defensive. When we think about them, and we think about the relevance of where they're often built, in this instance on a hill, that has a profound effect on the way we actually interpret why it was built. If you imagine, if something is important, and in this case, this site, which is ritualistic in nature, you're going to build it on a hill. Why? Because anything that is important, it's always lifted up, it's always raised up. If it's important to us as human beings, we always put it in a place of prominence. So it's important to understand that to help us relate to why it was built up here. People will have probably had to travel in the same way we're travelling as well, because so far, in an archaeological sense, based on the data, there's no domestic settings up here. So domestic settings must have been elsewhere, and people made a point of travelling to this site. Of course, it would have been lovely to come up here on a nice clear day, but I think on days like today, when it's cloudy and it's drizzly, it gives the area so much more spirit. It makes it so much more dynamic. And the views of the sea from here in Sussex really do command respect on a natural level and on a spiritual level. You really feel an invigoration of the senses. And here, just as a demonstration, here, this stuff, chalk, which is basically what makes up all of the surrounding land around us, the fundamental material, or one of the fundamental materials of Sussex.
The Whitehawk Camp is a scheduled ancient monument and dates back some 5,500 years. The site is considered to be one of a ritualistic nature and demonstrates evidence of burials and feasting. The causewayed enclosures represent some of the earliest ritual circles in Northern Europe, dating to roughly 3,500 BC.
This is it. This is the site right here, where around 3,500 BC, that's 5,500 years ago, we find the Whitehawk Camp, a Neolithic site of ritualistic nature, where people came, people feasted, where people buried the dead. And this is it. It's amazing and it's so exciting. I know we can't see very much up here, But when you're actually on these sites, when you're actually on the ground in which our ancestors walked on, where they lamented the dead, where they feasted to remember loved ones, and you can come up here and you can feel that little essence that's left by history. It warms the heart, which is good because it's quite chilly today. Now there's a little sign over here which should give us some of the details, which has been set up by Brighton and Hove Council to show people what is actually up here. So, what you can see from this here are the number of excavations that have taken place over time. Some of the early ones from back in 1929, working our way through the 1930s, all the way up to the excavations of the early 90s. And you can see here this line, this dark blue line, these circles, one within another, with these partitions, these little breaks. Now what that is demonstrative of are the ditches that have been built with these, as I've mentioned earlier, causewayed sections, which is what makes this a causewayed enclosure. That's why this is not a defensive place. That's why this isn't a fort, for example. This is a site where people are actively encouraged to come in. That means that this site would have been known not just by the people who lived in this vicinity, but it would have been known by people for miles around. Think about this position. If you imagine these houses aren't here, the cars passing, the roads, none of this is here. And up on this hill, you have a site which is practically calling out to people who can see it. And what's really important to understand, so when I've spoken about the people who are buried here, they've actually found intact graves with grave goods and the like. And what they've even found as part of the grave goods are fossils. Now, of course, the fossils would have been gathered from the local landscape. You have to remember at one point, this was probably under the sea, but the proximity to the coast, what did they see in these things that made them so important for them to be buried with? Did they see some ritualistic significance? Or was it just purely aesthetic? Was it because they found them beautiful? The fossils in particular are actually sea urchins. Possibly we'll never know. But when you couple the animal bones, especially of ox, that are found up here, it demonstrates that there are great feasts happening up here. So this was probably a place of buzzing activity, laughter and joy, but also sorrow and, as I said earlier, lament. And you can imagine it, can't you? A landscape like this on a day like today. You could imagine maybe some Neolithic funeral procession. Has all the sort of the feelings of I can't quite find the words, to be honest, but now, as you saw earlier, I picked up huge chunks of chalk. Well, some of the artefacts that have actually been found up here are pieces, large chunks of chalk with what's called within archaeology as incised markings. They are deliberate markings made in the chalk, and it's made up like a grid reference. We don't actually know what it was for. We don't know what its purpose was, but obviously these are early forms of, how can I put it? whatever the marks are, they are made with purpose and they are made to signify something. It just goes to show that our ancestors, just like us today, are preoccupied with understanding, with demonstrating meaning. And that is also what this site gives us. It gives us meaning. And now people bring their dogs up here. More meaning. I feel as though I'm being a little bit too whimsical, and I'd wanted to be straight down the line, historical facts, but when you actually come up to these sites and you know that people from thousands of years ago were actually up here, it takes you somewhere else. On a final note, what we find up here, not just human remains, but we find ceramics and we find tools made from flint, and ceramics obviously being made from clay. What does that tell us about these people? It tells us that they were industrious. It tells us that they were interacting with the landscape in a dynamic way. They were crafting tools and they were crafting goods that demonstrate how they interfaced with the landscape and utilised it for their lives. Which obviously begs the question, have we changed? I don't think so.